The Conquest of Malacca. Even though it is a great achievement and in an incredible way, it is an untold story of our ancestors. And despite containing the greatest warrior of the seas that this planet has ever seen, his deeds are always on the sidelines and in the shadows of so many others who came later with due respect to their deeds. Few can compare to the feared lion of the seas, the Captain Afonso de Albuquerque. Our intention was not to tell stories and already famous names, but you, channel subscribers around the world, teach us every day that the untold stories are much more untold than we imagined. So let's tell this one too. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Portugal was not only sovereign in the warlike domain of the seas, with its ships ahead of its time and its cannons centuries ahead of the rest of the world. Portugal had mastery of maps, sea currents, winds, navigability, geopolitics, and sufficient administrative intelligence to aggregate all of this and put it together and put it into practice. It is no wonder that Luis de Camões and Os Lusíadas called the first children of the Casa de Avis the Inclita generation. This nickname is well deserved. In addition to all these attributes that propelled Portugal to the top of the world, in order to understand the conquest of Malacca, it is necessary to understand one more attribute that always goes unnoticed by historians. Portugal had an above-average knowledge of territorial strategy and geopolitical strategy. The conquest of Malacca did not consist only in dominating a random kingdom of riches, as is populated in the world's imagination, because Portugal already had that. And remember, Portugal never had bellicose adventures of fleeting conquests. The Kingdom of Malacca had two crucial points that the Viceroy, the Lion of the Seas, the great Afonso de Albuquerque, detected as essential for the establishment of Portugal's influence there. 1. Strategic point. An obligatory passage channel for all Eastern trade. A totally control point. The lord there would be and will be the lord of all the East by sea. Disputed even until today in the middle of the 21st century between great Eastern powers. 2. Long-term geopolitical strategy. The Chinese did a lot of trade there, and they were the biggest empire on the planet. But they have always been very closed with foreigners. Contacts with Europeans were always very difficult, but Portugal was willing to trade anyway. Calincut's method was discarded because the fury of the Chinese would bring certain defeat, and Portugal knew that the Chinese people are people who have a cautious diplomatic doctrine and an empire that is too complex. He preferred the cautious approach and lasting friendship. For that, Malacca would be another step. Gaining control of the main trade route, the Chinese emperor would have to receive the Portuguese embassy sooner or later. What Afonso de Albuquerque sought with this was not just to be received by China, but to deal with them on an equal footing, as the Chinese emperor was known for using his strength in negotiations by imposing his conditions. Adding these two main factors unknown by the majority, we can introduce the other factors so propagated in history. Contact with the Portuguese. Diogo Lopes de Sequeira's expedition arrived in Malacca in September 1509, and the Captain General immediately tried to get in touch with the Chinese merchants in the port. They invited him to dinner aboard one of their merchant junks and received him and managed to arrange an audience with Sultan Mammoth. The Sultan sympathized with the Portuguese and promptly granted them authorization to open a trading post and provided them with a vacant building for the purpose. However, the powerful merchant communities of Gujarati and Javanese Muslims felt their interests threatened by the presence of the Portuguese and convinced Sultan Mammoth and Bendita to betray and capture the Portuguese. The friendship between the Captain General and the Sultan was such, those first contacts revealed a special friendship so great that he forgot that a ruler is subject to the policies and influences of his time even though there is reciprocity in their friendship. So Sequeira was so convinced of the Sultan's goodwill that he disregarded the information that Duarte Fernandez, a new Christian who spoke Parsi, obtained from a Persian innkeeper about ongoing preparations to destroy the fleet, confirmed even by Chinese merchants. He was playing chess aboard his flagship when the Malay fleet, disguised as merchants, attacked the Portuguese ships en masse. The Portuguese shot down all attempts to approach their magnificent warships, but there was a problem. There were Portuguese on land, and this surprise attack left him unable to bring them aboard. And the Captain General was being forced to retreat. Finding themselves unable to land any forces to rescue the Portuguese who had remained at the trading post, the Sequeira decided to return to India before the monsoon set in and completely trapped them in Southeast Asia. Before leaving, he sent 2 captives to the Sultan and the Blessing, each with an arrow through the skull as a threat of what would happen to them if any harm befell the 20 Portuguese who surrendered and would be left behind. Preparations for the conquest. There's nothing bad that can't get worse. When Sequeira arrived in India in April, he learned that Afonso de Albuquerque had replaced Dom Francisco de Almeida in the government of India. So that you understand the context in which the facts are taking place. Dom Francisco de Almeida is returning to Portugal after the famous and epic Battle of Dio where, in order for this battle to take place, he disobeys the king's direct orders brought in hand by Afonso de Albuquerque who came to succeed him, who, incidentally, arrests him. He takes his ships and faces the captains, intimidating them, because he wanted to know who from there would also deny him the power to avenge the death of his son. By this time the facts have occurred and he is returning to report to the king and everything is back to normal. Afonso de Albuquerque is the Viceroy of India. But even knowing that Afonso de Albuquerque had replaced Dom Francisco de Almeida in the government of India, he immediately left for Portugal, as he was very afraid of reprisals for having supported Dom Francisco in his revenge. Meanwhile that same month, in Lisbon, Dom Manuel dispatched another fleet under the command of Diogo de Vasconcelos to trade directly with Malacca, assuming that the Sequeira had managed to establish commercial relations with the city. The communications at that time were years. Vasconcelos reached the island of Angediva in August 1510, and there he found Afonso de Albuquerque with his fleet, preparing to conquer Goa. The island of Angediva. Albuquerque had received messages from the Malacca captives, written by the factor Rui de Araujo, and sent by emissaries from the most powerful merchant in Malacca, a Hindu named Nina Chatu, who helped the Portuguese. Araujo had indicated the Sultan's military strength, the strategic importance of Malacca, as well as the atrocious captivity in which they found themselves, being tortured so that they would teach the Malays to build and make firearms.
Sir, we cannot give your grace an account entirely of the things of this earth, because, as captive my and full of fear, who are among the worst people that God has created, we dare not ask about them, nor practice them with anyone. Their bombardments, those that are there, most of them, are like muskets, and others like those that used to be in Calica, which they take off with pills stuffed in their mouths, and for some and others it elects bombers and gunpowder, which one of the greatest options they gave us, and ever now we receive, was and is for that reason, and our Lord wanted that of this mind that we are. None of them knew how to do it, and according to the weakness of some and much tribulation we had. Ye have no doubt that, for their salvation, one would not have done a bad deed.
Letter from Rui de Araujo to Afonso de Albuquerque, written in Malacca on February 6, 1510. Albuquerque was, therefore, perfectly aware that Vasconcelos' orders were out of date, and managed to convince him to help conquer Goa instead of proceeding to Malacca uselessly. Goa fell to the Portuguese in December, but shortly afterwards Vasconcelos was arrested for having mutinied against Albuquerque. The governor then took control of the expedition and left Cochin to conquer Malacca in April 1511 with 18 ships, 11 ships, 3 caravels, 2 galleys, and 1,000 soldiers, 700 Portuguese and 300 Malabars. Indian Ocean crossing. During the voyage to Southeast Asia, the Armada lost a galley and an old ship. In the kingdom of Petir in Sumatra, the fleet rescued 9 Portuguese who had managed to escape from Malacca. They reported to Albuquerque that the city was internally divided and that the Bendara had recently been assassinated. There they also intercepted several merchant ships from the Sultanate of Gujarat, an enemy of the Portuguese. Passing through Pasem, the Portuguese came across 2 junks, one from Coromandel, which was immediately captured, and another from Java that weighed more than 600 tons. It was a junk bigger even than the flagship, the Flor du March. Albuquerque demanded that they calm down, but was answered by gunfire, and the Portuguese quickly followed suit. However, the Portuguese artillery proved to be ineffective. The pellets bounced off the hull of the junk. After 2 days of continuous bombardment, the masts of the junks were knocked over, the deck burned by shell fire, 40 of the 300 crew killed and both rudders destroyed, and it finally surrendered. On board the Portuguese found the King of Pasem, whom Albuquerque hoped to exchange for the prisoners in Malacca. Portuguese conquest. Afonso de Albuquerque, second governor of India. Lion of the Seas, a great strategist, leader, commander. I will try not to give personal comments, but here one needs to go. Pay attention to some points that he adopted as the main objectives he chose and how he starts to succeed. Goal: 1. Rescue your countrymen. 2. Conquer Malacca. See that first is your countrymen. How does he do it? The way he had as a leader and an absolute odd warrior. Impressing, demanding and not giving space, and mainly, as a Lusitanian without blinking, with firmness. Let's continue. The Armada arrived in Malacca on July 1st, to the sound of artillery salvos and displaying battle preparations, which caused great fear in the port. Albuquerque declared that no ship would sail without his permission, and immediately sought to negotiate the return of prisoners still held by the Sultan. As Albuquerque considered the Sultan's conduct dishonorable and treacherous, he demanded that he return them without ransom as a sign of good faith. My comment: remember, he had King Pasem for ransom, but he took the principle of firmness. The Sultan responded with vague and evasive answers and insisted that Albuquerque sign a peace treaty first. The Sultan was not a fool, he was also a skilled negotiator. In addition to being a great warrior and experienced in wars, he also had his tricks. In fact, the Sultan was only looking to gain time to fortify the city and summon his fleet, whose admiral the Portuguese identified as Lasmain. Albuquerque, however, continued to receive messages from the prisoner Ruy de Araujo, who informed Albuquerque of the Sultan's military strength, through Nina Chatu. The Sultan had at his disposal 20,000 men, including Turkish and Persian archers, thousands of artillery pieces and 20 war elephants, but he noted that the artillery was crude and lacked gunners. Even Albuquerque would later inform the king that only 4,000 were of real military value. Once again Portuguese and Turks would face each other in distant lands. The Sultan, in turn, was not overly intimidated by the small Portuguese contingent. Albuquerque would later write to King D. Manuel that the Sultan had managed to correctly estimate the total number of soldiers on board his fleet with a margin of error of less than 3 men. The Sultan therefore remained in the city organizing the defenses, not realizing the great danger he was in. A great warrior stays with his men. After weeks of stalled negotiations, in mid-July the Portuguese bombarded the city. Frightened, the Sultan promptly released the prisoners and Albuquerque took the opportunity to demand a heavy compensation, 300,000 crusaders and authorization to build a fortress wherever he wanted. The Sultan refused. Presumably, Albuquerque had already anticipated the Sultan's response. The governor gathered his captains in council and revealed to them the attack would take place the following morning, July 25, Dia de Santiago. Anyone who knows the history of Portugal knows that this date is very significant for the period. During the negotiations, Albuquerque was visited by representatives of various merchant communities, such as the Hindus, who expressed their support for the Portuguese. The Chinese offered to help however they could, but Albuquerque asked them for nothing more than barges to help land the troops, saying he did not wish the Chinese to suffer reprisals if the attack failed. He also invited them to watch the fight safely from afar, on a Portuguese galley, and authorized anyone who wanted to leave to sail from Malacca, which left the Chinese with a good impression of the Portuguese.
O descobrimento de Portugal. As histórias não contadas de nossos antepassados.